just a little bit to explain something about how I came to be in the rabbinate. I studied theology and religious studies with a view of being a teacher, but it was a very Christian faculty. And the more I was there, the longer I was there, the more I was drawn to Judaism and became less and less interested in studying other religions. I wanted to know more. I wanted to teach Judaism. And I had an idea of maybe teaching in a Jewish school, except that in those days, this was 50 years ago, the only Jewish schools there were Orthodox, and there was no way they were going to employ someone like me. And I was sitting in the junior common room one day thinking, what on earth was I going to do with my life? When I noticed a newspaper, and a picture on the newspaper of one Rabbi Jackie Tabick, newly ordained as the first woman rabbi in the UK. And I thought, that's it. That's being involved in Judaism. That's teaching Judaism. That's exactly what I want to do. And I wrote Jackie a very long and involved letter, and she very sweetly replied saying, I've only been a rabbi for 2 weeks. I can't possibly answer your questions. And that was so typical, I think, of Jackie, the sort of the modesty which she still carries to this day. Although not only is she the first woman rabbi in this country, but she is the only living person in this series of great progressive thinkers, the people who have shaped our movement. And so it's with great pleasure I have to ask you a few questions. Jackie, beginning with the question, how does it feel to be among the great progressive Jews?
I couldn't believe that I was part of them, actually. I'm still here, all the rest of them. It's just not part of my worldview. It's just not part of who I am, really.
And yet, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been inspired by your life and your example. I'm sure there are many other women who've joined the rabbinate because of you. But I'd like to start by asking you why? Why become a rabbi?
Well, I think it was actually some of the same reasons that I hear from you. I grew up, part of the reason might have been to try and come to terms with the death of my father. My father died when I was 8. And so, like many people who have an early death of a parent, in fact, I was amazed at how many of the rabbinic family have actually experienced this. You sort of try and work out what is death, what is life. It becomes existential questions become incredibly important. And as you get into your teenage years, these questions are ever more important. And I belonged to a lovely synagogue, Southwest Essex, as it was in those days, Reform Synagogue. And I started going there when I was 10. And my mother was in the choir. She had a wonderful voice. And I had to be in the choir too, therefore, because she couldn't leave me at home on my own, as my brother and sister had already flown the coop. So there I was. So I was at services regularly. And I was very useful in the choir because I could read Hebrew and could read music. The singing wasn't important, really, but those two things were vital, and I could help out. And I also then joined, and I suppose because I had these questions, I joined something called the World Union for Progressive Judaism Youth Section. It was called Whoopsies for short, because who could manage that mouthful all the time? And as an organization, it ran conferences in Europe for interested progressive Jews, sort of university age and up. And it had produced numbers of rabbis, Rabbi Jonathan Magnet, Rabbi Colin Eimer, Rabbi Jeffrey Newman. I met them all there at this conference. I was one of the last. I mean, Larry too, my husband, of course, was also part of this group at one point. and indeed was chairing conferences up in the north at one stage. So we were very much involved with this. And I was training to be a teacher. I went through university, I read history, I concentrated on 1066 and also on the orders, the monastic orders. But I wanted to learn about Judaism and I wanted to teach. And somehow the rabbinic world was a possibility, I thought, maybe. Though, in fact, when I joined the college, I wasn't sure I was going to become a rabbi. That came much later. I really just wanted to learn and then maybe to be able to teach somewhere. Wasn't sure where.
Do you think if you had said you wanted to be a congregational rabbi, they would have accepted you at the college at that time?
An interesting question. I don't know. I really don't know. When I went for the interview, there was sort of 5 or 6 men on the other side of a table and me, which was a bit daunting. I was only a kid, really. I don't know, was it 21? That's very young. I don't know what they would have done. There were a couple of women who went to the college to seek admittance before me, and they somehow got rid of them. They went off to, one went off to live in Israel, one here. Both of them got married off and somehow didn't join the college. I read much later a report from my rabbi, Rabbi Dov Marmor, alav shalom, who said that the college would have great difficulty getting rid of me on the grounds of knowledge. As you know, I did know some Hebrew, which was unusual in those days for women. I mean, there was no Jewish day schools except for the JFS. And I did know about taking services because I've been doing it since the age of 15 in the synagogue. And I did, get involved in Jewish life all the time. So he reckoned they would have difficulty getting rid of me. But I don't know. I mean, they didn't give me a grant because I wouldn't promise that I was going to become a rabbi. So maybe they would have accepted me. I don't know. But it meant the first year I didn't get a grant.
What sort of obstacles did you encounter in those years at the college?
Well, first was getting in. I applied and I didn't hear anything. And meanwhile, of course, I'd finished my degree and a teaching diploma and had been offered a job. And I really had to tell the school whether I was coming or not. And I was still hearing nothing from the college. So I popped into the office and there was a lovely secretary there called Jacqueline, actually. And she was wonderful. And she said to me, drop a note to Rabbi Hugo Grin with a copy to the college. So I did that. And lo and behold, they then answered me. Apparently, my letter had gone from desk to desk and no one had dared answer it. So at that point, they allowed me to come in for the interview. At the interview, as I said, they asked me whether I would become a rabbi, and I said I didn't know. Therefore, I got no grant, which was quite daunting, really. They also asked me to read Hebrew. They didn't ask that of any of the male applicants to the college, nor did they ask them whether they were going to become rabbis. But they did ask both those things of me. As I said, it was unusual probably in those days for women to have any degree of knowledge of Hebrew. But Rabbi Dov Marmor had taught me for my O-level. So I'd studied the Book of Ruth and Book of Kings in Hebrew. And luckily, I'd also started reading the Mishnah with him because they gave me a book of Mishnah, Barachot, and I was able to read and translate the first few bits. And that was it. They couldn't really
turn you down.
Yeah, that was it. Then I was in. Other obstacles at the college came from the other students. There were some students, I think, who didn't really like having a woman around. When I became chair of the student union, as I did at one point, one of the students called me the mother duck, which I did not appreciate. It was difficult. Money was tough the first year. I remember stuffing my shoes with newspapers because I couldn't afford a new pair, and I had a hole. I did earn some money because I was given a job at West London Synagogue. The other thing was that all other students had to serve in a different congregation each year to give them a breadth of experience. But I was only allowed to work at West London Synagogue. No other congregation would touch me, just in case.
So at what stage did you actually decide to become a congregational rabbi?
Well, I was working on my theses. We had to produce two in those days. And one of them was on the status of a foundling baby. No Google, no internet, right? So what did you do? You went to somebody who had an encyclopedic memory. And in our case, it was Rabbi Louis Jacobs. He was a great teacher. And I went off to see him to find out what I should be looking up. And he had this incredible library with steps and a photocopier there. And he was pulling books off the shelves one after the other and telling me which pages to photocopy. And while I was in the middle of doing all this, he suddenly looked at me and said, "You know, there's nothing wrong with you becoming a rabbi." And then he continued doing stuff. And I thought, "Ooh." And I really respected Rabbi Louis Jacobs.
Yes. Well, coming from Rabbi Jacobs, of course, because he was, a major Talmudist and himself Orthodox. I mean, yes. I think he described himself as Orthodox to the day he died, even though he was not recognized by the United Synagogue. And for him to say it meant that there was, in his view, halachic precedent and certainly no halachic obstacle to your becoming a rabbi. So that was certainly an endorsement.
I think he felt that one could somehow wiggle it through. I was one of his favorite students, thank God. I managed to prove him wrong once, and he was one of these great teachers who liked it when students proved them wrong.
So did you, it was obviously quite tough for you. And this would have been in your final year then that you made that decision that you would like to. So you must have started looking for jobs, and that presumably
at the beginning of the year it was, yes, and then we started looking for jobs, yes.
And so what was that like?
Well, it was sort of odd because I hadn't had much experience in the pulpit. Because at West London, I was ushered into an educational role. And even that had been a bit difficult because I looked terribly young and people thought I was a bat mitzvah girl. And what on earth was this bat mitzvah girl doing in charge of the religion school? I did look very young. And Rabbi Grin did not very much allow me to be on the bima at normal times. At the High Holy Days, for example, I was very limited on the bima. And afterwards, by the way, the first year I had to go up to the women's gallery afterwards, which was lovely up there. You could see a great view. Until the women rebelled after that. And
so you were allowed on the bima, but you were not allowed to sit.
Exactly.
With the men in the congregation.
Of course. Obviously, that was normal then. Anyway, so I hadn't had much of that sort of experience. The year before I qualified, I rebelled against Rabbi Grin. And actually, strangely enough, I took the services over at West Central. So, I took services there, and that was my first High Holiday service and my last, as a rabbi, though I've taken services since. So it's really odd, quite, things go in circles. So I did rebel a bit. But when jobs came up, Rabbi Grin always had an argument as to why I shouldn't apply for certain jobs. I think he wanted to keep me, which he did. There were times, it was a very odd time. Everybody knew who was going to get which job anyway. As it was, it's a very small world and people knew what was going on. mean, there was a whole group of us who went in one car for an interview in one synagogue, because we knew none of us were going to get the job, so we thought we might as well go in one car and have a nice evening out. Um, you know, and eventually, of course, I was given a job at West London, but only as educational director, not as rabbi, because as rabbi, they would have to put it to an AGM or an EGM, and they were not sure they wanted the row.
Right. So how long were you there as education director before you became a rabbi as part of the rabbinic team there?
It was really a couple of years. It was when Rabbi Danny Smith joined. And then they put both of us to the EGM together, and nobody complained. Somebody, I remember saying, does that mean that the people I buried will now stay buried? And that you'll have to listen to my sermons or something, But even so, I was not allowed to do very much on the Bima at West London during the High Holy Days. But then I really enjoyed the overflow services much more anyway, so I didn't mind.
Right. So, I mean, was there anybody who was sort of rooting for you or supporting you in those days? Because it sounds like it was a very lonely path you were treading.
In the rabbinate or in the...
Well, I was thinking of in the rabbinate. I mean...
Well, most of my colleagues were very lovely. There were some who were not. When I was first joining the Assembly of Rabbis, Rabbi Lionel Blue, who was a great friend eventually, I mean, we were great friends, really, in the end, asked me to become the catering officer. And, you can imagine that. So I sent round a cartoon which had a women's lib meeting, and underneath, everybody at loggerheads at this meeting, yelling and screaming and hitting each other. And underneath was a little thing that said, well, someone has to make the tea. So I sent this round and said, okay, but in fact, he saw that this was not right. And I never was. And it was Rabbi Lionel Blue who, in the end, got me taking services at West London. Because after I became education director, I was sitting at the services and the overflow in the congregation. And this was about a year after my ordination. And I hadn't been given any part to play, really, major role in the services at all. And a message came, Rabbi Lionel Blue is not feeling well and would like you to come up and take the service for him, please. So without preparation, I went up and took the service. And I checked many years later, and of course it was a ruse. He was just anxious to get me on the Bima, though it was a bit nerve-wracking with no preparation whatsoever. But there I was.
Right. So that was very much the start of your career, and you're now coming to the end of it. What do you consider to be the greatest achievements in your career?
Oh, I love the fact that there's a fair number of rabbis who seem to have been influenced by me to come into the rabbinate, because we need you all. And I love that. Some of my students from the synagogues that I have served to become rabbis. A son has become a rabbi, another son's become a Talmud teacher. I mean, it's lovely. That's good. One of my students from West London is now an Orthodox rabbi. He works in Israel. Leo D, whose wife and 2 daughters were killed on that road. Again, the family, yes. And when I wrote to him to offer my condolences, I didn't really expect an answer back, but he immediately wrote back. And I saw him at Limud, and he introduced me to everybody as his first rabbi, which I thought was amazing, this Orthodox rabbi doing that. And there's been others since then. So that's one achievement. Another achievement was West London Synagogue became mixed seating in the High Holy Days. That's good. The number of bat mitzvahs grew astronomically at West London. When I arrived, there was about 1 bat mitzvah to about 7 or 8 bar mitzvahs. by the time I'd been there a few years, it was an equal number, which was good. And I changed totally their observance of Purim and Shavuot. Purim, when I was first there, everybody sat in total silence in that big cavernous room, about 30 people, listening to the Megillah without a sound. By the time I left, the place was absolutely packed with families, all dressed up. The noise was incredible and it was great. Shavuot, very few people came to the service in the evening, but following the LJS pattern, and I introduced a Seder, and that too. So things like that.
And of course, you've been very involved in things like interfaith. I mean, I think you've had quite a...
Yes, in fact, I'm now actually on the board of KAISID, which is a big interfaith organisation, international group. So yeah, since October the 7th, it's been very difficult.
Looking back over your sort of 50 years, I have to say you still look very young. I mean, I'm flattering you too much on this. I should be a bit tougher.
What do you want?
But I mean, you know, it is a long time. Do you think that the rabbinate has changed? Do you think that, you know, progressive Judaism has changed as a result of having women in the rabbinate?
It's very, I mean, society has changed, has it not? It's no longer surprising to find a woman doctor or a woman CEO. Mind you, CEOs are still few and far between, and high court judges are a bit few and far between, but there are more of them. So I think the beginning of women getting involved was in some ways a little bit of inclusivity coming into the movement. And that, of course, has now spread and includes LGBTQ+, and also trying to make sure that we include people who may be neurodivergent or have other issues with their health. So I think maybe that has been a woman's role, or at least an offshoot of the woman's role. The liturgy has changed because of that, so that we don't talk so much about God as he anymore. We're aware of God being neutral in gender. Over the years, I mean, we've had women rabbi groups which were much more somehow supportive of each other than the entirety of the rabbinic group was. You know, we have supported each other and we have been friends with each other. Much more so, I think. You know, the thing about it is it's a spectrum, isn't it? There is the so-called male end, you know, which is the group who would always talk at every meeting and talk loudly and not allow anyone else to talk. And oh yes, smoke-filled rooms we don't have anymore either, which is great. So there is that group, and there is the you know, the stereotypical idea of the woman on the other end, who is nurturing and inclusive and sympathetic and empathetic. But there is a blurring in the middle, isn't there?
Yeah.
And so some women go off in one direction and some women are more in the other direction, and the same for the men.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, I know when I started, I very consciously, you know, in a sense, imitated the men, because there was a sense I felt that you wouldn't be taken seriously as a woman unless you kind of downplayed your femininity, which meant, you know, dressing in black suits and fairly somber and very serious. I don't know, where did you feel? Did you make a conscious decision one way or another, or you know, to feminize the rabbinate rabbinate, or did you sort of go the
No,
same way?
I never thought about that. I mean, it took me many, many, many years to accept that I had been the first woman rabbi, and that this may be important or not. I don't know.
Right.
But it took me a long time. I kept remembering a joke that I'd heard about the Russian orchestra that came to London. And the conductor said, "Oh, well, you know, we have got 6 Jews in our orchestra. How many Jews have you got in your orchestra?" And the London orchestra conductor said, "I don't know, because we don't count them."
Yes.
And I've always wanted to be seen as a rabbi, not the woman rabbi, certainly not the first woman rabbi.
Yeah.
So I haven't tried consciously, but I am, I suppose, a very feminist person. I'm happy being a wife and a mother, and delighted to be a grandmother. I mean, that's obvious. So those feminine roles, I love cooking, I love sewing. Those are very important things to me, but they're part of who I am as a total bundle. And there's lots of other bits of me as well. The bits that like pastoral work, the bits that like teaching, the bits that like doing interfaith stuff or whatever. So I never consciously, I suppose in terms of dress, I was quite conservative in my dress. I've never worn a talit because I've never felt comfortable with it. Because don't forget, no woman was wearing one before me.
Yeah.
So I just have not felt comfortable. It was just not a thing. And I've never...
Was there ever any pressure on you to wear one?
There have been people who've asked me to, and there's been many congregants who've said, "We're glad you don't." So, but I think women have always had a pressure on them, and I don't know whether our younger colleagues do, as to what we wear. Yeah. So men have always found it right to comment on what I've worn. Yes.
Yes.
And
which is completely unacceptable today, but I can imagine was very much.
It happened all the time.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but when you came and taught the rabbinate, but when it was common for men when they came up to have an aliyah to assume they could kiss me.
Yes. Yes. The number of times I've heard people say, "That's the first time I've kissed a rabbi."
Oh, yes.
And I mean, I was very tempted.
I hated it.
My response occasionally was, "I'm so sorry. Had I known, I would have shaved this morning."
I never thought of that answer.
One of the things is, I mean, do you think that the rabbinate, as a result of women, taking the role of a rabbi, that the actual perception of the rabbinate has changed? I'm very aware that the teaching profession got somehow demoted once women started taking, or becoming.
I know many of our male colleagues were very worried, and I think they might have been right, that the salary that rabbis received has been lessened by the fact that there are women in the rabbinate. And it could well be. When I first got my job at West London, I was severely underpaid by West London. And I was told that it didn't matter because I was married and my husband could earn the money for me. That was assumed. Was it? I don't know by your time whether that was assumed, but certainly in my time.
Yes, I didn't have that sort of experience. But then for a long time, I was working part-time.
For many, many, many years. Basically, at the end of a college year, of a college experience, the men got the jobs and then the women got what's left. And, I know that for many women, working part-time was a choice and a good one. But I'm also aware that sometimes they were forced into it.
Yeah. That was certainly my experience. I couldn't find a full-time job, though I wanted one, and started at Ealing part-time. And then I had my family. And so then it suited me very well to continue working part-time. But thinking about today, do you have any advice what advice would you give somebody, a woman who's contemplating becoming a rabbi now?
It's a wonderful job. It's great. If you like people, it's important. If you want to study, if you want to give to the Jewish world, it's fabulous. If you like variety in your job, it's fabulous. But I think I would, having seen the experience over the years, I would say to them, it's better if you can get another qualification first, so that you have a second string to your bow. Because if things don't work out that well, you've got something to fall back on. And I think I would very much say that to people. I might say it to some males as well, but certainly females.
What do you think were the sort of funniest incidents that you experienced?
I mean, I've told these stories before, and I apologize if you've heard them. But yeah, I mean, there's been very funny stories, like when I was a student rabbi and I was invited down to take a service in a liberal congregation in South London, and I will not tell you what it was. And they used to carry the scroll in to the service because they'd forgotten it one day, and it became the custom. So they wanted to give me the scroll to carry in, and I looked at this thing and it was bigger than me, and I said, no, you carry it. So anyway, they carried the scroll in. It was Friday night, but they always read from the scroll Friday night, so I read from the scroll. Afterwards, the chairman came up to me and said, we had a debate whether you should be able to touch the scroll. Don't forget, this is over 50 years ago, about 52, 53 years ago. And by a majority decision, we decided you could touch the scroll. But I'm so pleased you didn't. So I didn't tell him that, of course I did, because I was rolling the scroll on so I could read it, right? But I didn't tell him. But I saw his wife laughing in the distance. So I went over to her and said, tell me the joke. She said, we take the scroll home every week from here. Who does he think lifts it up and dusts under it every week? That was another one, like when I was at West London, Friday afternoon. Police arrive. There's a man threatening to throw himself off the justice courts in the Strand. He wants to see a rabbi. So Hugo looks at me and says, you go. So off I went. And I was taken in this police car, and I can't even stand roundabouts at the fair. This police car took 15 minutes to get from West London to the Strand on a Friday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, right? Down the wrong side of roads, round roundabouts the wrong way. Got there. The only way to talk to this man was to climb up 5 levels of scaffolding. I can't even stand on a chair without difficulty, let alone a ladder. So they looked at me, and one of the firemen there looked at me and said, I'll talk you up. So he came up with me 5 levels, go all the way up to the top. And there's this guy sitting there. He's furious. He's lost custody of his children. And he's taking revenge by throwing tiles down on the judges' cars, the Rolls Royces and the other, all these wonderful cars underneath, right? They're all getting smashed by these tiles coming down. What does he want? He wanted to know what time Shabbat was due in so that he could get to the police station, because he knew he was going to the police station, before Shabbat started, because he was Orthodox. So I told him. And, he said, right, he said, I don't need to talk anymore. He said, I'm not going to throw myself off. You don't need to worry. That's all I need to know. And he carried on chucking these tiles down. So I said to the police, you don't, oh, no, we'll bring in They brought in a negotiator that he wouldn't talk to. But meanwhile, I was at 5 flights of scaffolding, and I had to come down. Oh, it was terrible. And then when I got to the bottom, of course, the police didn't take me back to West London, did they? And I hadn't got my handbag with me. So I had no money. But luckily, one of the firemen again gave me some money so I could get home again to West.
So for those of you who think that being a rabbi is simply standing up on a Saturday and giving a sermon, think again. You see all of life as a rabbi. I think this is a very good moment, actually, to see if there are any questions.
You were the first woman rabbi, and I believe that Julia Neuberger was the second. And I read in one of her books that she said that she let the media have its story about her being the first woman rabbi, but then to use that interest to get across her own views on various issues. And I wonder whether that was a relief for you or whether it was a little irksome.
I took no notice of it. She was a friend. She could do what she wanted. You know, she and I were friends at that. We don't see each other now, but at that point we saw each other regularly, and better than me having to answer it all.
Yeah, I just wonder whether it was a little bit of a relief for you that you weren't in that limelight in the same way that she was.
I let her enjoy it.
There is a question from Dean. Jackie, you're an inspirational woman. Do you feel that other religions can learn from you the way you are, your views, and in what way?
It would be a very peculiar attitude, I think, for me to have. I know many people, of course, in other religions, and we all learn from each other, and that's what is good. I've certainly learned from female colleagues in other religions. When I just qualified, I was going to a course on pastoral work at Westminster College, and there was a Unitarian minister there she and I were talking. She said, "Don't worry," she said, "people soon get used to the idea of having women rabbis or women clergy." She said, "In my congregation, I was about to leave, and a little boy asked me, 'Well, who's going to be the minister after you?' And I said, 'Mr. So-and-so.' And he looked at me in disgust and said, 'A man? How could there be a man?' And that gave me a lot of courage and a lot of thought. We all learn from each other. I hope that we all inspire each other.
Thank you. Larry, shall we try again?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, that's right. You young ladies make me feel very, very old. I can remember your semiachas. But what I really wanted to tell you or ask you, what was the reaction from the general public? I remember at that time when you both actually became rabbis, there were comments about, is this a job for a woman, etc. And my response was, why not? What possibly could be obstruct a woman from being a rabbi? And eventually, of course, everyone got used to the idea. But I do remember a tentative young lady entering Ealing Synagogue for the very first time to take
Yes.
and since then, both of you have done remarkable things. Well done.
Well, I have to say there was a lovely old lady at Ealing Synagogue who once said to me, "It's so nice to have a lady instead of a rabbi for a change." And I think, I mean, certainly my sense was that actually women had more of a voice when women became rabbis. Certainly, I think pastorally,
Yeah.
I think women feel more comfortable talking to women. I think
Exactly.
probably men had more of a problem. That was my experience.
I found actually that the members, some of the top members of the Women's Guild had a lot of problems with me.
Right.
Because they saw me as a threat. Once I had children, that threat was removed and they became friends.
That's
But
interesting.
until I had children, that was a threat. I remember one morning when, by this time, I had 2 little ones, and I'd come into the shul. I'd taken the children's service. I had then, no, first of all, I'd done the Torah breakfast. That was it. Then I'd taken the children's service, which started at the same time as the main service, then come down to the main service in time to read Torah and preach. And in Kiddush afterwards, one woman came up to me and she said, "I don't know how you do it. No wonder you have to be late with your little children." Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. We have another question from Toby. What has been your biggest challenge as a rabbi?
I hate leaving congregations. You become part of the family. And it's very hard to leave. It's like a shutter comes down. It's like a divorce happens. And that I found a big challenge. That makes sense.
Thank you. We have a question from Chris. Thank you for this informative talk. I just wanted to ask you to see a time when more disabled people are in key positions in the progressive movement.
As I said before, I think there has been a growth of inclusivity within the movements, and a greater understanding of making room for others to join us properly. I was furious at the Sternberg Center that there was not, I mean, my father was on the wheelchair, he had multiple sclerosis, and I was furious that at the Sternberg Center, we can get a wheelchair user up to the ground floor, but we cannot get a wheelchair user any further up. And I think this is a great loss. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to change the mikveh so that a disabled person can go in. Because the way the mikveh is at the moment, for health and safety reasons, I have often had to say to people, "I am sorry, but I cannot authorize you to enter this mikveh." Because I would be really worried for their safety in getting down the steps into the mikveh. And I was really very upset that we couldn't change the mikveh while I was in charge of the Bet Din to enable those who are disabled to enter. But of course, the categories of disability are huge. From the mental challenges to the physical challenges. And some are more difficult to deal with than others. Some of them are more challenged than others. I would hope that certainly the physical difficulties are really in some ways the easiest and should be dealt with so that everybody can join in. I did ask at one point whether we couldn't have a Braille prayer book, but I was told it was just much too expensive. We did try, I really did try at one point to start the idea of a Braille. And there was in Edgware, there have been some of the prayer book actually transcribed into Braille, which we were able to share with somebody in another congregation who needed that facility. But I'm sorry that the Reform movement and now the Liberal movement, or maybe the whole of the Progressive movement, can't get together to provide these resources so everybody can feel they can be part of the movements.
And may I just add that I think we do have currently in the college a few students with different abilities. So in terms of future leadership, we may see more people with different leaders, rabbi leaders with different abilities leading us. Howard is asking, "Hi Jackie, great talk, thanks. Interested in your thoughts. how to build bridges with orthodoxy while staying true to progressive Judaism.
There are some areas that we can already be partners with the Orthodox world. And we have been partners with the Orthodox world, if only quietly. Many years ago, there was, in fact, a very unpublicized committee or group that used to meet at the chief rabbi's house. It was chaired always by the chair of the Council of Reform and Liberal Rabbis. But it met at the chief rabbi's house, and the leaders of different Orthodox groupings would come to those meetings, as well as the leaders of the Reform and Liberal movement. And as the chair of the Council of Reform and Liberal Rabbis, as I was at one point, I was chairing that meeting in the chief rabbi's house, which was interesting. And there was a lot of cooperation. It was a group that tried to stop big controversies breaking out that would divide us. So they were dealt with quietly in the background. It was also a group that helped us work together for Israel against anti-Semitism, for the disabled, for Jewish charities. So all these things that we could do together, we were doing together without having to disregard our different theological positions. The group fell apart a little after Rabbi Hugo Grin's death, because of this difficulty that the Orthodox world had in attending his funeral and in making statements to the press that he was a destroyer of the faith. But on the other hand, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, personally to me, was very supportive. I had tea with him on a number of occasions. He gave me his phone number because he said, you know, one of the loneliest things that a rabbi can be is when their colleague dies and they're left alone. And he was really incredibly supportive. But then things fell apart because publicly one couldn't actually work together. And then the Council of Reform and Liberal Rabbis stopped soon after me. The next chair didn't really want to do it. And so the whole thing stopped. And that's sad because it was a group that worked very closely. So there is possibilities, certainly on Israel, on charity, anti-Semitism, all those sorts of things. The community can work together.
And of course, now there are Orthodox women rabbis, and I think they are also sort of looking to us to, you know, as an example to follow, and encountering the same sort of challenges that we did. So
some of us talked together at Limud. It was great.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. We have another two big questions and only a few minutes. So I will ask them, and maybe you can think of a one-liner, do your rabbinic magic to try and answer them in a nutshell. One from Elizabeth and Mike would like to hear a bit more about your thesis on the work of the Beit Din. And a fellow Californian Jew who joined us from across the pond is wanted to hear a bit more about why you didn't feel comfortable wearing a talit.
My thesis, you're very welcome to access this at the Liebet College. It's there in the library if anyone's interested. It enabled us to look at and it was interesting. It was very positive. It seemed to indicate that most people who convert through the Reform movement, I didn't look at the Liberal movement, so I'm afraid I can't answer that. But those who converted through the Reform movement, in general, took up the position that their partner had. And most of the people who converted were marrying Jews. And it was heterosexuals rather than LGBTQ plus people. And that has changed over the last years. But it was very interesting to see how, for some people, it was such a positive experience, whereas I felt very sad for those. There was one person who said, "I'll always feel a second-class Jew, and I'll always feel as if I'm sitting on the reserve bench." I felt for that person. And I think it's a warning to us all to make sure that people feel included as a Jew. Why I don't wear a talit, I've been called a bit of an awkward frummer. And I think I probably am. In my personal life, our family is really quite traditional, you know. The fact that one son belongs to a modern Orthodox yeshiva and the other one is in a Masorti rabbi, you know, that may be part of the fact of our upbringing here. And I've just not felt comfortable. And prayer is difficult enough without feeling comfortable. So I haven't yet succumbed, but there's always yet, you never know.
Thank you. And Jackie, if you look at the messages, you can see all the love that is poured at you and the session today. Thank you very much, Rabbi Jackie, Rabbi Sybil, for taking part in this series of progressive thinkers. I miss you, Jackie, wandering around the Sternberg Center in the corridors, and I haven't seen you for a long time, so it's nice to see you here on the screen.
Thank you very much, Amit, and thank you very much, Sybil, for doing this. It really,
thank you so much. Thank
it really is. Thank you so much indeed. And I miss you all at Sternberg Center. I like working. I enjoy working.